Officer Sophia was driving down the street, minding her own business, when suddenly, a police officer steps in front of her car. But not just any officer, this one's got a gun drawn. But wait, there's more. The officer is aiming that weapon at none other than a senior female Army officer. In that moment, a simple traffic stop escalated into a situation no one could have predicted. The tension in the air was thick, dangerous even. What happened next will shock you. Welcome to Stories with Mr. Gray. If you love uncovering the truth and standing up for justice, hit subscribe, like, and drop the flag of your country in the comments below. It all started like any other day. Officer Sophia, a senior female in the Army, had just finished a routine meeting and was heading home. As she drove down a quiet street, she noticed a police car tailing her. Nothing out of the ordinary, until the lights flashed behind her, signaling for her to pull over. At first, she thought it was a simple traffic stop, maybe a speeding ticket. After all, it wasn't the first time she had been pulled over in her life. But as soon as she pulled over, things took a sharp turn. Officer Mattins, a man who'd been with the force for years, approached her vehicle. His hand hovered near his holster, a subtle yet alarming sign of tension. This wasn't routine. She could feel it in her gut. His movements were jerky. Something was off. The conversation started normally. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked, but his voice was tight, almost forced. Sophia expected a routine traffic stop, nothing more. But his nervousness was palpable, like he was looking for an excuse to escalate things. His eyes darted nervously around the car. Sophia's military training kicked in, alerting her to the unease radiating off him. Without warning, the officer pulled his gun from the holster. The cold steel of the weapon was aimed directly at her through the driver's side window. The sound of the metal clicking into place echoed in her ears. "Get out of the car," he ordered, his voice strained. Her heart raced, but she didn't panic. Years of military training kicked in. She had been in high-pressure situations before, but nothing like this. She knew the importance of staying calm. The officer's hands were shaking, his eyes wide with what appeared to be fear, or maybe anger. He wasn't just shaking from adrenaline. There was something deeper at play. Maybe it was his own biases, the anger he didn't know how to control. His finger hovered on the trigger, and Sophia could feel the power dynamic shifting. "What is this about? Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice steady. But the officer didn't answer. His silence was deafening, and the only sound was his shallow, panicked breathing. Sophia remained calm. No shouting, no anger. Her years of experience and discipline in the Army made her more than capable of handling this extreme stress. She knew this wasn't just a routine traffic stop. This wasn't about her speed. This was about something much deeper. The officer was acting out of fear, maybe hatred, but what was the cause? What had led him to this point? Was this simply a case of the officer being overly aggressive in a stressful situation? Or was there something more insidious at play here? Was it possible that racism was influencing his actions, even though they were clearly in a professional setting? The silence between them stretched on, suffocating. His breath quickened, his grip tightening on the weapon. "Step out of the car now," he commanded, his voice faltering, losing the authority it had once had. Sophia didn't move. She locked eyes with him, her gaze unwavering. "No," she said simply. "You're going to take me to the station. Right now." The officer's hand clenched around his weapon, his knuckles white. "Get out of the car," he repeated, more forcefully this time. But there was no conviction in his voice. He was cornered. The woman wasn't complying, and she wasn't afraid. This wasn't how he thought this would go. "No," she repeated, her voice steady but firm. "I'm not getting out of this car until you take me to the station. I want to speak to your superior." The officer's face twisted in confusion and frustration. He was losing control, and it was clear in his eyes. "I don't have time for this," he muttered. But there was no authority left in his words. The gun still pointed at her, but now it seemed to weigh more than it had before. His hand shook slightly, betraying his growing unease. "Take me to the station," she demanded again, her voice cold and commanding. "I won't let you walk away from this. You need to explain yourself to someone who's not going to let you off the hook." Her words cut through him. His mind was racing. He had a million reasons to escalate. Protocol, pride, his own authority, but it was all slipping away. The officer's finger, which had been so tightly gripped on the trigger, now hovered uncertainly. He was out of options. He didn't know what to do next. "You don't want to do this," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He was trying to regain control, but the cracks were there. She had taken the reins, and he knew it. "I already am," Officer Sophia replied, her voice sharp, cutting through the air. "Take me to the station. Now." Her words were like a switch that flipped in Officer Matten's mind. His resolve crumbled. With a shaking breath, he lowered his weapon. He was beaten, not physically but mentally. He wasn't the one in control anymore. "Okay," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He moved to the passenger side and opened the door. "Get out," he said, almost like he was following her command instead of giving one. As she stepped out of her car, she felt the weight of what had just happened. She had turned the tables. The officer, once in full control, was now following her orders. But this wasn't just about power, it was about justice. She knew this wasn't over. She would make sure it wasn't. The officer didn't say another word as he led her to his patrol car, his face pale and his eyes avoiding hers. He wasn't just taking her to the station. He was taking her to the beginning of something much bigger. She wasn't just going to let this slide. As Sophia was driven to the station, her mind raced. The adrenaline of the confrontation was beginning to fade, but the weight of what had just happened was settling in. This wasn't just about her personal safety. It was about the way law enforcement treated those who looked like her, those who had been historically marginalized. The officer's behavior wasn't just an anomaly. It was part of a larger, more dangerous trend. Studies had shown time and time again that people of color were disproportionately targeted by law enforcement, subjected to harsher treatment in encounters that should have been routine. And this was one of those moments. Another instance where a person, simply by the color of their skin, was treated with suspicion, aggression, and violence. But this time something had changed. Sophia had not been passive. She had fought back, not physically but mentally, emotionally. She had demanded accountability. Inside the patrol car, the officer drove in silence. His knuckles still gripped the steering wheel, pale from the force of his hold. Every once in a while, he would glance at her from the corner of his eye. The woman's face was unreadable, calm, composed. But in his mind, he knew this was far from over. The tension was thick. He kept his eyes on the road, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. The sound of his own breathing was loud in his ears. The weight of the gun in his holster felt heavier now, like a reminder of how badly he had miscalculated. He couldn't believe it. This woman had turned the situation completely around. She hadn't backed down. She hadn't complied. And now he was driving her to the station like a criminal. He'd been a cop for years, seen countless traffic stops, and never once had he questioned his authority. But this felt different. He felt exposed, vulnerable. The tables had been turned, and now he was the one in the hot seat. Sophia could see the officer's inner turmoil, even if he didn't show it. His tense jaw, his furrowed brow, the way his hands gripped the wheel. She knew he wasn't as calm as he appeared, but it didn't matter anymore. She had taken control of the situation. When they arrived at the station, the officer Mattens hesitated for a moment before he opened the door. His footsteps were slow, reluctant as he led her inside. Sophia followed, every step measured, every action deliberate. She wasn't here to make trouble. She was here to make sure justice was served. Inside the station, the air felt different. It was heavier somehow. The atmosphere, cold and sterile. stood in stark contrast to the fiery tension that had simmered outside. Officer Mattins walked her to a desk sergeant, his voice still shaking as he explained what had happened. His words were robotic, almost as if he was reading from a script. "She refused to comply," he muttered. "I was forced to bring her in." But the sergeant didn't respond the way he expected. He didn't offer any sympathy. Instead, he raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by the situation. "What do you mean she refused? You just said you pulled a gun on her. You didn't give her a chance to do anything." The officer's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. But it wasn't the sergeant he was angry with. He was angry with himself. How had he let this happen? How had he let his own biases and fear take control? The sergeant stood up, his face stern. "You need to take responsibility for your actions," he said. "This is not how we do things. Not here." Sophia stood to the side, watching the exchange unfold. She wasn't satisfied yet. She knew this was just the beginning. She wasn't going to let it go until there were consequences. Until someone took a real stand against this kind of behavior. The officer's face turned pale as the sergeant's words sank in. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. He had made a mistake, no, a series of mistakes. And now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. But it wasn't just about him. It was about the system that allowed him to act with impunity. And that, she realized, was the real battle. Sophia's mind was already moving forward. This wasn't about a single officer anymore. It was about the larger issue, systemic racism in law enforcement. She knew the fight wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. The consequences for this officer were swift. But the consequences for a broken system would take much longer to fix. And as she stood there, in the cold, sterile air of the station, she made a promise to herself. She wouldn't let this story fade into the background. She wouldn't let it be another statistic. This was her fight now, and she was going to make sure her voice was heard. As Officer Mattins and Sophia stood in the station, the air was thick with tension. The officer's face was flushed, his body still trembling from the encounter. He hadn't fully processed what had happened yet. He hadn't understood the gravity of his actions. But the woman wasn't about to let it slide. Not now. She knew it was time. The moment had come for her to reveal who she really was. The time for silence was over. And with that, she stepped forward, standing tall, her voice clear and steady. "You think this is over?" she asked, her words cutting through the cold, sterile air of the station. The officer's head jerked up, confused. He had expected a different kind of confrontation, maybe anger, maybe accusations. But not this. Not the calm, controlled way she stood there. "What do you mean?" the officer asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. His posture was defensive now, as though bracing himself for something worse. Sophia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, official-looking card. She placed it on the counter in front of the sergeant, sliding it gently across the desk. The officer's eyes narrowed as he watched, not understanding what was happening. The sergeant picked up the card without a word, but when he saw the emblem on it, his expression shifted. The officer watched in stunned silence as the sergeant's eyes widened, his mouth opening in shock. This can't be," the sergeant muttered, looking up at the woman with disbelief. You're a senior officer?" The woman nodded, her expression still calm but firm. "I'm a senior officer in the Army, and you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." Officer Mattin's face was drained of color. His mouth went dry as the realization hit him like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just some random civilian he had pulled over. This wasn't a simple mistake. He had pointed a gun at an officer in the military. Someone with training, someone who could easily have escalated the situation. He had miscalculated badly. His fears, his prejudices had blinded him to the truth. But now, he saw the consequences of his actions, and they were far worse than he had imagined. The sergeant's gaze shifted between the officer and the woman. He didn't say anything, but his face told the story. He knew exactly what was at stake now. This wasn't just about one cop's poor judgment. This was a breach of protocol. One that could have catastrophic consequences for the department. The officer stood frozen, his mind spinning. How had he not realized who she was? He had let his own biases take control, allowed his fears to dictate his actions. Now he was standing in front of a senior military officer, a woman who could destroy his career with a single phone call. There was silence in the room. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. The officer's heart raced as he tried to come to terms with what had just happened. He had just made an enemy of someone with the power to end him. But it wasn't just his career on the line. This was bigger than him. It was about everything she stood for. It was about the years of training, discipline, and hard work that had led her to this moment. And it was about the countless other victims who had faced similar treatment, only without the power to hold anyone accountable. Sophia looked at him, her eyes piercing through the officer as though she were seeing straight into his soul. "You will answer for this," she said, her voice low but unyielding. "And I won't rest until every part of this system that allows you to act this way is exposed." The officer couldn't speak. He couldn't argue. He had no defense. His world had just collapsed, and he could feel the walls closing in on him. The sergeant stood, his face grim. "This is serious," he said. "You're not just facing a reprimand here. This could be the end of your career. You don't pull a gun on a senior officer and get away with it. We'll take it from here." Sophia stood there unshaken, as the officer's fate was sealed. She wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning of what would become a broader reckoning. As Officer Mattins was escorted away by the sergeant, Sophia took a deep breath. This wasn't about personal revenge. It was about the larger picture. It was about the systemic racism that allowed moments like this to happen. And she wasn't going to let this moment go to waste. This was her fight now, and she was going to make sure everyone knew it. Sophia reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, dialing a number with purpose. Her voice was firm, unwavering. "Get me the chief of police," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. The phone rang once, twice, before the chief picked up. He sounded groggy at first, caught off guard by the urgency in her voice. "This is Officer Sophia," she said, her identity and authority clear in the way she spoke. "I need you to take action on something immediate." There was a brief pause before the chief responded, still processing her tone, but his hesitation quickly turned to concern. "What happened?" he asked. "You've got an officer here who has violated not just department protocols but the trust of the community," she replied, her voice steady but intense. "He pointed a weapon at me today. He acted out of bias and fear, and I need you to take swift action. He is no longer fit to serve in any capacity. I want his immediate dismissal." The chief's voice faltered slightly as he processed the gravity of her words. "This is a serious accusation, but you have my full attention. I'll get the paperwork started right now." "Good," she replied, her words sharp. "And I want a full investigation into the department's training practices. This is not just about this officer. This is about the systemic failure to recognize and correct behavior like his. No more delays. Make it happen." The chief, now fully awake to the urgency, responded, "Understood. I'll take care of it." But even as he spoke, she could tell that the wheels were already turning. She wasn't asking for reforms. She was demanding them, and the system would have to bend to her will. She hung up the phone with a sense of finality. The officer's fate was sealed, but that wasn't the end. The real work had just begun. She wasn't interested in the headlines or the media. She wasn't looking for a victory lap. She was focused on long-lasting change, systemic change that would prevent moments like this from happening again. Sophia walked out of the station with her head held high. The officer's dismissal would be swift, the investigation would begin immediately, and reforms would follow. This wasn't about one moment or one officer. It was about the future and making sure that the systems in place were corrected, reformed, and held accountable. As she stepped into her car, ready to leave the station behind, she knew the road ahead would be long. The work of reforming an entire system wasn't something that could be accomplished in one day. But today she had started the process, and that was enough for now. The real change would come from within, from people who had the power to challenge the system when it failed, from those who would speak out when it mattered most. And this woman, this senior officer, was one of them. Her voice had been heard, and it would echo through the corridors of law enforcement until change was made. So, take this story to heart. If you see injustice, don't stay silent. Take the steps you can to demand accountability and ensure the system works for everyone. If you've learned something from this story, if it's made you think about the role we all play in holding systems accountable, make sure to subscribe. We'll continue to bring you stories that challenge the status quo and inspire change, just like this one. Don't forget to like, share, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Together, we can be a part of the change we want to see. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.